darkness, knowledge emerges.
I remember the moment the sun dimmed, not by cloud or storm, but by the passage of Imperial warships settling into bombardment orbit. It was during the third hour of morning shift when I stood at my census station in Administrative District 7, processing tithe compliance reports with the mechanical efficiency that 23 years of service had drilled into my bones. The lumen strips overhead had been flickering power rationing, they said temporary adjustments to accommodate increased military transit through the sector, but when the actual dimming began, it came from outside, from above, from the sky itself turning grey as if something vast had interposed itself between our world and the light we took for granted. I looked up from my data slate, a reflexive gesture, meaningless inside a windowless administrative complex, but I felt it nonetheless. Felt the change in air pressure, the sudden weight pressing down on the hive city like an enormous hand settling over an insect. The other clerks felt it too. Conversations died mid-sentence. Quills stopped scratching across parchment. In the silence that followed, we heard it. The low, resonant hum of void ship engines holding position in high orbit, a sound that penetrated ferrocrete and plasteel to vibrate in your chest cavity, to remind you that there were powers above you whose attention was never a blessing. My designation is Census Clerk Tertius 749 Hadrian, though my mother called me Valis before the Schola Administratum claimed me at age 7 and taught me that names were imprecise, that identities could be reduced to numbers more efficiently than to syllables burdened with sentiment. I have served in this capacity recording populations, tracking births and deaths, monitoring migration patterns within the hive for 2 decades and 3 years. I have filed 17,412 reports. I have processed casualty estimates from 3 labor riots, 2 plague outbreaks, and 1 structural collapse that claimed 14,000 lives in Lower District 19. I have learned to translate human suffering into numerical data without allowing emotion to corrupt the accuracy of my documentation. But when the sirens began, when every voxhorn in the administrative district activated simultaneously in a wail that rose and fell like the keening of something wounded and enormous, I felt the professional detachment I had cultivated for 23 years crack like poorly tempered glass. The sirens meant Imperial Navy presence, meant military authority superseding civilian governance, meant something had gone so catastrophically wrong that the Imperium's most direct and terrible solutions were being deployed. I had heard these sirens only once before, during a compliance action against a suspected genestealer infestation in Sector 42. That had ended with 3 city blocks reduced to slag and 30,000 citizens purged as potentially compromised. But that had been localized, containable. This was different. The sirens were city-wide. Planetary, perhaps, the kind of alert that suggested the threat was not confined to districts or sectors but extended to the world itself. My hands moved without conscious thought, gathering the census slate and the leather satchel containing my most recent reports. Archival instinct, perhaps. The need to preserve documentation even when documentation has become irrelevant. Around me, other clerks were reacting with various degrees of panic, some frozen at their stations, some already moving toward exits, some kneeling in prayer to the God Emperor whose protection suddenly seemed very far away. Senior Administrator Vecht stood at his elevated podium, his augmetic voice amplifier crackling as he attempted to restore order. Remain at your stations. This is likely a routine military transit. Continue your assigned duties. The Emperor protects. But his voice carried no conviction. His augmetic eye, a crude replacement for the organic one he'd lost to a data slate explosion years prior, whirred as it attempted to focus on something beyond the chamber, as if he could see through walls to the sky where the warships hung. And his hands, I noticed, were gathering his own documentation, sorting through files with the desperate speed of someone who knew evaluation was coming and found his records wanting. I did not remain at my station. Discipline and protocol have their limits, and those limits are defined by the point at which obedience becomes suicidal. I moved toward the exit, joining the stream of clerks and Administratum functionaries who had made the same calculation, whose survival instincts had overridden their conditioning. The corridors were filling rapidly, not with panicked crowds yet, but with purposeful movement, People evacuating with the organized efficiency that Imperial citizens maintain even in crisis, because chaos invites summary execution from the Arbites, who enforce order through fear. The exterior courtyard of the administrative complex provided my first clear view of the sky, and what I saw there turned my intestines to ice water. They were not warships in the conventional sense, not the patrol cruisers or system defense monitors that occasionally passed overhead. Their presence announced days in advance through proper bureaucratic channels. These were capital vessels, battleships and cruisers, their hulls kilometers long, their Gothic architecture rendered in adamantium and faith, their weapons batteries visible even from ground level as rows upon rows of lance batteries and macro cannons that could reduce continents to ash. There were dozens of them, arranged in formation that suggested not transit but deployment, not passage but occupation. They hung in the sky like tombstones, their shadows falling across the hive city in patterns that turned day into premature dusk, their presence so vast that perspective itself became meaningless. The crowds were gathering now. Not just Administratum personnel but civilians from the surrounding districts, drawn by the sirens and the unnatural darkness, by the instinct that tells prey animals when predators are near. They filled the plaza outside the administrative complex, thousands of them, tens of thousands, all staring upward with expressions that ranged from fear to confusion to the desperate hope that this was somehow routine, somehow explicable, somehow not what every primitive part of their nervous system was screaming it was. I clutched my sensor's slate against my chest like a talisman, like a shield, like proof of my value and function. I had documented this population. I had recorded their numbers, their occupations, their contributions to the Imperial tithe. I had filed reports that confirmed their compliance, their productivity, their worthiness of continued existence. Surely that documentation mattered. Surely my service, my meticulous recording of every detail the Administratum required, had earned some measure of protection. But the warships hung in the sky regardless of my documentation. And I understood with sick certainty that my census records my life's work, my testament to dutiful service, were as irrelevant as prayers shouted into a void. A woman near me was weeping, clutching a child who seemed too young to understand, but old enough to absorb her mother's terror through osmosis. An elderly man knelt in the plaza, pressing his forehead to ferrocrete in supplication, his prayers audible even over the crowd noise. A group of Arbites enforcers moved through the gathering, shock moles visible, maintaining order through presence alone, because actual violence would have sparked stampede, and stampede would have meant casualties that someone would be required to document, and no one wanted that responsibility. "What does it mean?" someone asked. I did not see who spoke. The voice came from the crowd, from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. What have we done? What had we done? The question assumed culpability, assumed that the Imperium's judgment was proportional to offense, that catastrophe arrived as consequence rather than as arbitrary expression of power. But I had filed reports for 23 years. I had documented compliance failures and tithe shortfalls and population deviations from projected models. I had noted irregularities in manufacturing output and discrepancies in gene seed purity testing and delays in prayer quota fulfillment. Every world had such issues. Every population deviated from ideal models because ideal models assumed precision that organic systems could not maintain. But apparently our deviations had accumulated beyond acceptable parameters. Apparently someone, some distant authority in some orbital command throne, had reviewed our world's records and found them sufficiently deficient to warrant the deployment of capital warships, had found us sufficiently compromised or corrupted or simply inconvenient that extermination had become preferable to remediation. The sirens continued their wailing, the crowds continued to gather. The warships continued their patient hovering, and I stood there with my census slate pressed against my chest, understanding that the world I had spent my life documenting was already condemned, that everything I had recorded, every birth and death, every tithe and prayer, every number carefully transcribed into proper format, was now merely the historical record of a world that would cease to exist. Even then, in that moment of realization, I sensed our doom had been determined long before the warships arrived, long before the sirens activated, perhaps long before I had filed my first report. We were not being judged now. We were being executed for judgments already rendered, sentences already passed, in chambers so distant and elevated that our protests would never reach them, even if we dared to voice them. The sky had gone dead, and we, who lived beneath it, would follow shortly. The Administratum officials arrived within hours, descending from orbital transports in numbers that transformed the crisis from military to bureaucratic, with terrifying efficiency. They came in grey robes marked with the seal of the Departamento Exactus, carrying portable cogitators and document cases sealed with purity wax, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks that suggested they considered our very atmosphere contaminated. I watched them disembark from Valkyrie transports in the administrative district's central landing plaza, their movements coordinated with the precision of a military operation, which in a sense it was warfare conducted through paperwork rather than plasma, through audits rather than artillery. Senior Auditor Magistrate Helix, I learned his name from the designation stamped on the requisition order he thrust into my hands, established command in what had been Senior Administrator Vector's office, displacing Vect himself to a subordinate desk in the outer chambers. Helix was ancient, augmented extensively to prolong function beyond natural lifespan, his face more metal than flesh, his eyes replaced with multi-spectrum optical implants that clicked and whirred as they scanned documents with inhuman speed. When he spoke, his voice emerged from a vox grill embedded in his throat, flat and emotionless, purged of any tonal quality that might suggest humanity. "This world has been flagged for comprehensive compliance review," he announced to the assembled administrative staff. Perhaps 300 of us crammed into the main processing hall, the air thick with incense meant to sanctify the proceedings and fear sweat that no amount of sacred smoke could mask. All documentation pertaining to the past 50 years of tithe fulfillment, population census data, manufacturing output records, and purity certification must be produced within 72 hours. Failure to provide complete records will result in summary classification of non-compliance. 72 hours. 3 days to produce half a century of documentation, to organize records that had been filed across dozens of archive facilities, many of which used incompatible data formats, some of which had been destroyed in the very disasters they documented. It was impossible. It was designed to be impossible. This was not an audit seeking truth. This was an audit seeking justification for a decision already made, a paper trail to legitimize extermination, a bureaucratic formality that allowed distant authorities to claim due process had been observed. But we tried. Emperor help us, we tried. I spent the first day in Archive Complex 7, a vast underground facility where physical records dating back 2 centuries molded in climate-controlled chambers that had not been properly maintained in decades. The air down there was thick and stale, tasting of decomposing parchment and failed preservation protocols, the lumen strips flickering with power fluctuations that cast everything in stuttering, unreliable light. Other clerks worked alongside me, pulling files from towering shelves that groaned under the weight of imperial bureaucracy, coughing from the dust we disturbed, occasionally collapsing from exhaustion or despair, or the simple futility of our task. Report 74 Tertius 19, Population Census for District 47, I read aloud, transcribing data onto my slate while another clerk cross-referenced it against current records. Population baseline, 473,000. Current population, 412,000. Variance, negative, 13%. Cause of variance? The other clerk asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion. I scanned the supplementary notes, finding explanations that had seemed adequate when originally filed but now read like confessions of failure. Plague outbreak, year 817. Structural collapse, year 823. Labor riot, year 831. Natural attrition, insufficient detail. Came a voice from behind us. One of Helix's subordinate auditors stood there, a woman whose augmetics had replaced most of her lower face with data interface ports, her expression, what remained of it, conveying nothing but bureaucratic disapproval. Plague type must be specified. Structural failure must include engineering assessment reports. Labor riot requires Arbites incident documentation and culpability assignments. This record is incomplete. It will be marked as deficient. But the plague was 60 years ago. I protested, immediately regretting the outburst, because protest implied criticism of the process, implied that the requirements were unreasonable, and suggesting that imperial bureaucracy was unreasonable was itself a form of heresy. The original medical officer died in the outbreak. The engineering reports were destroyed when the archive facility in that district was irrelevant. The auditor interrupted, her vox-enhanced voice cutting through my explanation like a blade through parchment. Documentation either exists or it does not. Acceptable explanations for missing documentation exist or they do not. The absence of records is itself evidence of non-compliance. She moved on to inspect another clerk's work, leaving me staring at my census slate, at the data I had compiled with such care, watching it being classified as deficient, as inadequate, as proof of failure rather than evidence of service. Around me, other clerks were receiving similar judgments, their life's work dismissed as insufficient, their documentation marked with red ink that signified condemnation. By the second day, entire blocks were being purged. I did not witness the first purge directly. I was still in the archives, still frantically searching for records that would satisfy the auditor's impossible standards, but I heard it. The sound of massed las fire, distant but unmistakable, the crack of individual shots merging into sustained roar that spoke of wholesale execution. The Vox network carried fragmentary reports before those reports were suppressed. District 93 had failed to produce adequate documentation of its manufacturing output. The entire administrative staff had been declared non-compliant. 12,000 workers were being processed for summary execution because the data quotas could not be met, because decades of records had been lost to fires and floods and simple entropy, because the Imperium's judgment required scapegoats, and scapegoats required bodies. The air above ground had changed by the time I emerged that evening, thick with incense. Yes, the ecclesiarchy had mobilized in force, sending priests and missionaries into the streets to lead prayers of atonement, to encourage confession of sins real and imagined, to prepare the population for judgment with the fervor of those who knew judgment was inevitable. But beneath the incense was another smell, acrid and chemical, the scent of promethium and burnt flesh carried on winds that blew from districts where purges had already begun. And everywhere, the ink, black ink from quills scratching desperately across parchment, red ink from stamps marking documents as deficient, purple ink from purity seals being affixed to every surface as if wax and prayer could ward off what came from orbit. The plaza outside the administrative complex had become an impromptu scriptorium, hundreds of clerks working at makeshift desks, processing records under the open sky because the archive facilities could not accommodate the volume of work demanded. Their faces were grey with exhaustion and fear, their hands shaking as they transcribed data, their eyes haunted by the knowledge that every error, every omission, every minor deviation from protocol could be interpreted as evidence of corruption, sufficient to justify execution. I saw Senior Administrator Vecht among them, no longer elevated at his podium but crouched at a common desk, his augmetic eye sparking from overuse, ink staining his robes where his trembling hands had spilled it. He did not look up as I passed, did not acknowledge anyone, simply kept writing, kept filing, kept performing the rituals of bureaucracy with the desperate focus of someone who believed that proper procedure could still save us, that if we could just produce the right documents in the right format with the right stamps and seals, the judgment hanging over us might be lifted. I wanted to tell him it was futile. Wanted to explain what I had begun to understand, that this audit was not evaluating our compliance, but manufacturing evidence of our failure, that every missing record was being interpreted as proof of corruption rather than mere administrative chaos, that we were being condemned not for what we had done, but for what the Imperium needed us to be, guilty, irredeemable, worthy of extermination. But I said nothing. What would be the point? Vecht already knew, they all knew. But knowing did not excuse them from the obligation to try. to maintain the fiction of process, to act as if their documentation could matter even when all evidence suggested it could not. Rumors spread through the administrative districts with the speed of plague, each one more terrible than the last. The Inquisition was involved, some said not just planetary authorities but the Holy Ordos themselves, investigating corruption that reached into the highest levels of governance. Others claimed a warp taint had been detected beneath the primary Manufactorum complex, that genestealers or chaos cultists had infiltrated our population, that we were being purged, not for administrative failure but for spiritual contamination. Some whispered that the tithes had been deliberately falsified for decades, that our world had been skimming resources meant for the Imperial war machine, and now the accounting had come due. I did not know which rumor was true. Perhaps all of them. Perhaps none. Perhaps the truth was simpler and more terrible, that our world had simply become inconvenient, that maintaining it required resources the Imperium could deploy elsewhere more profitably, that we were being eliminated not as punishment, but as optimization, our deaths merely an entry in some distant ledger where worlds were numbers and populations were variables to be adjusted. On the third day, I stopped sleeping. There was no time for sleep, no mental space for rest when every moment not spent searching archives was a moment that brought us closer to failing the audit, to being classified as non-compliant, to joining the districts that were being systematically purged. I worked through the night in Archive Complex 7, pulling files by the light of failing lumen strips, transcribing data with hands that cramped and shook, occasionally encountering other clerks who had made the same decision, whose dedication or fear or simple inability to stop had driven them to the same desperate midnight labor. We did not speak to each other, did not acknowledge our shared suffering, just worked in parallel, pulling records and filing reports, and trying to construct a defense against accusations we had not been formally charged with, trying to prove compliance to standards we were not permitted to see, trying to satisfy auditors whose judgment had been rendered before they arrived. I felt the weight of every form I had ever filed, pressing down on me like physical mass, each document now transformed from proof of service into potential evidence of failure. Had I recorded that plague outbreak with sufficient detail? Had my population variance calculations been properly annotated? Had I included the right supplementary documentation, cross-referenced the appropriate files, stamped each page with the correct seals in the correct positions? Decades of work, reduced to potential grounds for execution because Imperial bureaucracy demanded perfection from systems designed by fallible humans operating in impossible conditions. The 72-hour deadline passed. We had not completed the audit, had not even come close. Helix delivered his preliminary findings with the same flat, emotionless tone he had used for his initial announcement, standing at the elevated podium while we, what remained of the administrative staff, perhaps half our original number, the others already purged for various failures, stood below and listened to our condemnation. Initial review reveals systematic non-compliance across multiple categories. Population records show unexplained variances. Manufacturing output demonstrates consistent shortfalls against tithe requirements. Purity certifications lack adequate documentation of testing procedures. Gene seed quality control protocols show evidence of corner cutting and falsification. He paused, his optical implants clicking as they scanned the crowd, as if cataloging our faces for future reference, for inclusion in whatever final report would justify our extermination. This world has failed the Emperor. Its population has proven inadequate to the trust placed in them. Remediation is no longer viable. Recommendation for extreme sanction has been forwarded to Fleet Command. Extreme sanction, the bureaucratic euphemism for Exterminatus, for planetary annihilation, for the complete erasure of our world and everyone on it. Someone in the crowd screamed, a single voice, quickly suppressed by the Arbites who maintained order at the chamber's perimeter. But that scream spoke for all of us, vocalized the horror that professional decorum required we suppress. We had failed the audit. We had been found wanting. And now we would die, not as martyrs or heroes, but as bureaucratic errors, as populations whose non-compliance justified their elimination, as numbers being removed from ledgers because the numbers did not align properly. I looked down at my sensor slate, at the device I had carried for 23 years, that had been my constant companion through decades of service, that contained all my work, all my documentation, all my proof of duty faithfully performed. And I understood that it was worthless, that every report I had filed, every number I had recorded, every detail I had meticulously documented had been rendered meaningless by judgment that had nothing to do with the quality of my work and everything to do with circumstances beyond my control or comprehension. The audit was complete, we had been found deficient, and soon the sentence would be carried out. The Vox networks began to fracture on the fourth day, their broadcasts becoming unreliable, contradictory, shot through with static that sounded almost like screaming. I was in the administrative complex's communications hub when the first encrypted transmissions started bleeding through into civilian channels, messages we were never meant to hear. Military communications encoded with ciphers that should have been unbreakable but were apparently degrading under the strain of whatever coordination was occurring in orbit. The Vox operators, junior adepts trained to maintain communications infrastructure with religious dedication, stood at their stations with expressions of growing horror as they monitored channels that were supposed to be silent, that were supposed to carry nothing but approved broadcasts and Imperial propaganda. Containment breach in Sector 97. Requesting immediate. Inquisitorial authority confirmed. All local governance subordinate to plague vectors identified in 17 districts, recommend immediate isolation. And the transmissions came in fragments, partial sentences cut off by static or deliberate signal termination, but even fragments were sufficient to construct terrible understanding. The Inquisition was involved. Plague had been mentioned, not the common diseases that cycled through hive populations with seasonal regularity, but something else, something that required inquisitorial attention, something that justified the orbital blockade and the systematic purges that had been accelerating since the audits began. I stood behind Vox operator Secundus 47 Kelly, watching over her shoulder as she attempted to isolate the transmissions, to record them for proper review by authorities who might or might not still exist in any functional capacity. Her hands trembled on the control panel, adjusting frequencies that kept sliding away, as if the signals themselves were trying to avoid capture, as if whatever was being discussed wanted to remain hidden from those of us on the ground who were its subjects and victims. "Should we report this?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the static-laden hum of active Vox channels. "Should we inform Senior Administrator Vecht that—" "Inform him of what?" I interrupted, more harshly than intended. "That we intercepted military communications we lack clearance to access? That we're listening to channels whose very existence we're not supposed to know about? Reporting this would be admitting to unauthorized monitoring, which itself could be interpreted as evidence of corruption, of conspiracy, of tenetebre." I stopped, because another transmission was coming through, clearer than the previous fragments, spoken in a voice that carried unmistakable authority. Ordo Malleus oversight confirmed. Warp taint detected at level 7 significance. Primary Manufactorum complex shows evidence of demonic incursion dating back approximately 3 decades. Recommend immediate planetary quarantine with preparatory measures for Exterminatus protocols pending. The transmission cut off. The Vox operator's hands had frozen on the controls, her face gone white beneath the blue glow of her instruments. Around us, other operators had stopped their work, had turned toward the speaker from which that terrible message had emerged, their expressions showing the particular variety of fear that comes from hearing your death sentence delivered in bureaucratic terminology. Demonic incursion, warp taint. Ordo Malleus, the chamber of the Inquisition that dealt with threats from the Imperium itself, with corruption that went beyond mere heresy into the realm of existential threat to reality. If they were involved, if they had found evidence of chaos contamination, then the Exterminatus was not punitive, it was preventative. We were not being judged as failures, we were being eliminated as vectors, as carriers of corruption that could spread if we were allowed to survive. 3 decades, Vox operator Kelly whispered, her voice hollow. They said 3 decades. That means it started before we were born, before most of us were born. We've been living above that, breathing the same air, walking the same streets, never knowing that beneath us, we don't know anything. I said, though the words felt like lies even as I spoke them. We intercepted a fragment of a transmission. It could be incomplete, could be taken out of context, could be referring to something specific rather than... But I could not finish the reassurance because I did not believe it myself. The pieces were assembling into a picture too coherent to dismiss, too terrible to deny. The impossible audit demands, the systematic purges, the inquisitorial presence, the orbital blockade that prevented anyone from leaving. We were not being evaluated for administrative failure. We were being contained, quarantined, prevented from escaping a world that had been compromised beyond remediation, that had been hosting chaos corruption for decades while we went about our daily functions in ignorance, filing our reports and meeting our quotas while something monstrous grew beneath the manufactorums where millions labored in the Emperor's name. The Vox operators began receiving new orders within the hour, official orders this time, transmitted through proper channels with appropriate authentication codes. All civilian Vox access was to be terminated immediately. All communication between districts was to be routed through military channels, subject to review. Any unauthorized broadcasts would be met with summary execution of the broadcasting party and everyone within their immediate vicinity. They were silencing us, cutting off communication so that whatever was happening could proceed without coordination, without the possibility of organized resistance, without populations in different districts learning what was occurring elsewhere and potentially causing complications through panic or attempted evacuation. But cutting off official channels did not silence the rumors. If anything, it amplified them, transformed them from whispered speculation into urgent necessity, into information that people needed desperately enough to risk execution to share. I heard them in the corridors, in the archive facilities, in the brief moments between shifts when workers would gather in spaces where surveillance was less complete. They're sealing off entire sectors, not just purging the populations, physically sealing them, welding the bulkheads shut, filling the ventilation systems with something that makes the air unbreathable. The manufactorum workers in District 119 tried to evacuate through the undertunnels. The Arbites were waiting for them. All of them. Thousands. They burned the bodies in the forges to prevent the smoke from being visible. There's something in the lower levels, something that's been there for years. The senior engineers knew. They had to have known. You don't develop contamination protocols that extensive unless you're aware of a specific threat. I did not know which rumors to believe. Did not know which were based on genuine information and which were simply fear manifesting as narrative. The human need to construct explanation for horror that exceeded comprehension. But I knew that workers were vanishing, knew that entire sections of the hive were being sealed behind doors marked with red lacquered purity symbols, that the Arbites were no longer maintaining order but enforcing quarantine, that the distinction between law enforcement and execution squad had collapsed into irrelevance. My own work had become impossible to perform in any meaningful sense. Census taking requires access to populations, requires the ability to move between districts and conduct surveys and verify data through direct observation. But districts were being locked down with increasing frequency, their populations classified as potentially compromised, their numbers frozen in whatever state they had been when the quarantine began. I filed reports noting this, noting that my data was becoming increasingly unreliable, that I could not fulfill my function without access to the populations I was meant to document. The reports were acknowledged but not acted upon. I was told to continue recording based on historical projections, to estimate numbers rather than verify them, to maintain the fiction of accurate census data even when accuracy had become impossible. So I did. Because the alternative was to stop working, and stopping work meant being reclassified as non-essential, and non-essential personnel were being purged with increasing regularity to reduce the population that would need to be managed during whatever was coming. On the 7th day, I made the mistake of trying to visit my hab unit in Lower District 43, where I had maintained residence for the past 11 years. The transit systems had become unreliable trains running on irregular schedules, entire lines shut down without explanation, checkpoints established at seemingly random intervals where Arbites would examine documentation and turn back travelers whose destinations fell within prohibited zones. I was turned back 3 times before finally abandoning the attempt, accepting that I would not be returning home, that whatever possessions I had accumulated over decades of service, my few books, my personal data slates containing records I had kept for myself rather than for official review, the single picked capture of my mother from before the Shola claimed me, were lost, inaccessible, possibly already destroyed if my district had been sealed or purged. The loss felt both devastating and trivial. Devastating because those possessions represented what little individual identity I had maintained despite the Administratum's efforts to reduce me to my designation number. Trivial because what did personal effects matter when the world itself was being condemned, when my death was approaching not as individual tragedy but as statistical footnote in a planetary extermination. I slept in the administrative complex after that, when I slept at all. Many of us did. The halls filled with makeshift bedding, with workers who had nowhere else to go and nothing to do except continue their functions because function was all that remained, because the alternative to working was sitting idle and contemplating doom, and contemplation led to madness faster than exhaustion ever could. The Vox networks continued their degradation. By the 10th day, civilian channels were completely dark, broadcasting nothing but static and occasional bursts of what might have been prayer or might have been screaming. The audio quality was too poor to distinguish. Military channels remained active but encrypted beyond our capacity to decode, their traffic constant enough to suggest intense coordination but opaque enough to prevent us from understanding what was being coordinated. Then came the night when the Vox hub picked up something else. Not an Imperial transmission but something older, something that predated the Imperium's presence on our world. A signal emanating from deep beneath the primary Manufactorum complex, cycling through frequencies that should not have carried any content but somehow did, broadcasting in a language that was not Low Gothic or High Gothic or any dialect I recognized, but that nevertheless conveyed meaning directly into the mind of anyone who heard it. The Vox operators began screaming before I could order them to shut down their receivers, screaming and clawing at their headsets, trying to remove them even as the equipment seemed to resist removal, seemed to tighten against their skulls as if determined to force them to continue listening. I grabbed Operator Kelly by the shoulders and physically tore the headset from her head, the action requiring more force than it should have, as if I were pulling it away from something that was holding on. She collapsed immediately, blood running from her ears, her eyes rolled back to show only whites, her mouth working soundlessly as if trying to form words in that terrible language we had all heard, that had conveyed ideas that human language lacked vocabulary for, that had shown us truths about what existed beneath our feet, that consciousness was not designed to contain. 3 operators died that night, simply stopped living, their bodies shutting down as if their neural systems had been overloaded beyond capacity to recover. The others survived but changed, speaking rarely, avoiding eye contact, occasionally making gestures with their hands that resembled the symbols I had seen in prohibited texts, in documentation classified beyond my clearance level, in fragmentary references to things that should not be named or acknowledged or studied by anyone who wished to retain their sanity. I filed a report documenting the incident, described the signal, the casualties, the apparent source in the Manufactorum depths. I did not mention the content of what we had heard because I could not articulate it in terms that would make sense in official documentation, because attempting to transcribe those concepts would have required me to use language that was itself corrupted, that carried contamination in its very pronunciation. The report was never acknowledged. I do not know if anyone read it, if it was filed properly, or simply destroyed as evidence of knowledge we were not meant to possess. But I knew, now, knew with certainty that exceeded any documentation or proof. Our world was not merely administratively deficient. Our world was wounded at its foundation, had been hosting something from the warp for decades, had been gradually consumed from below while we worked and lived and filed our reports in ignorance. And now that the wound had been discovered, now that the Inquisition had documented our corruption, there was only one response the Imperium knew how to deliver. The Vox whispers had told us our doom, and we could do nothing but continue working, continue recording, continue maintaining the fiction of normal function while the machinery of our extermination was being prepared in orbit above our heads. The wind changed on the 13th night, carrying with it sounds and smells that transformed the hive from merely doomed to actively dying. I was still in the administrative complex. I had not left it in 6 days, sleeping in brief collapses at my desk between shifts that had ceased to have defined beginnings or endings when I felt the atmospheric shift. Not heard it, not initially. Felt it, the way you feel pressure changes before a storm, the way animals sense earthquakes before the ground begins to shake. The air itself seemed to thicken, to acquire weight and texture that it should not possess, to press against exposed skin with sensation that was almost tactile, almost deliberate. Then came the screaming, distant at first, emanating from districts I had mapped 1,000 times during my census work, from sectors whose populations I could recite from memory because I had documented them so thoroughly. District 93, where I had conducted my first independent census 17 years ago. District 107, where a particularly efficient administrator had maintained records so pristine they had been used as examples in training materials. District 48, residential zones where families had lived for generations, where children played in courtyards while their parents worked the manufactorums in shifts that consumed their lives in service to the emperor's tithe. All of them screaming now, all of them dying. The sound carried on wind that should not have been blowing because we were deep inside a hive city where weather was controlled, where atmospheric circulation followed patterns established by ancient ventilation systems, where wind was regulated and predictable and never carried the stench that was filling the air now. Copper, burnt parchment, something else beneath those smells, something organic and wrong, something that suggested flesh being transformed rather than merely destroyed, meat being rendered down and reconfigured according to principles that biology should not permit. I pressed my sleeve against my nose and mouth, the gesture futile because the smell was too pervasive to block, too invasive to filter, seeming to bypass the nose entirely and register directly in the brain as olfactory hallucination, or perhaps as direct perception of something that existed partially outside conventional sensory channels. "What is that?" someone asked behind me. Junior Clerk 9-2 Mervis, a young man who had joined the Administratum only 3 years prior, who still possessed the idealism that experience eventually crushed, who looked at me now with the desperation of someone seeking explanation that might make this comprehensible. "Containment breach," I said, the words emerging automatically, pulled from fragmentary Vox transmissions and whispered rumors and terrible understanding accumulated over days of watching our world die by degrees. Something beneath the manufactorums, something that was contained but isn't anymore, or was never contained as well as the authorities claimed, or has grown beyond the capacity of whatever measures were holding it. But what is it? I had no answer. Or rather, I had answers pulled from prohibited texts and heretical documentation and the Vox transmission we should never have heard, but those answers could not be spoken aloud without inviting immediate sanction from authorities who enforced orthodoxy through summary execution. So I said nothing, and Mervis took my silence for ignorance rather than caution, and we stood together at the viewport looking out over the hive city as entire districts began to darken, their lumen strips failing in cascading patterns that suggested systematic shutdown or perhaps consumption of power infrastructure by something that fed on energy as readily as it fed on flesh. The Arbites abandoned their posts. I witnessed it directly watched from the administrative complex's upper observation deck as enforcers who had maintained order through fear and violence for decades simply walked away from their checkpoints, removed their helmets and set down their shock mauls and stub guns, and joined the crowds of civilians who were evacuating toward what? There was nowhere to evacuate to. The spaceports had been locked down since the warships arrived. The transit systems were failing, the undertunnels were being sealed. But still they moved, driven by the instinct that says fleeing is better than remaining, even when both options lead to death. That motion provides the illusion of agency, even when agency has become fictional. I watched them stream through plazas and thoroughfares, thousands becoming tens of thousands, becoming hundreds of thousands, a human tide flowing away from districts where the screaming was loudest, where the darkness was spreading, where something was emerging from containment facilities that should have held but apparently had not. They carried whatever they could, children, elderly relatives, relics blessed by priests who had long since fled or died, ration slips that represented food they would never collect, Purity seals, they pressed against their foreheads as if wax and parchment could protect against what hunted them. Some carried weapons, improvised armaments, industrial tools repurposed for violence, stub guns stolen from abandoned Arbites posts, even a few lasguns whose power cells were depleted but whose weight provided psychological comfort, as if any weapon in their possession could matter against what was coming. As if anything short of orbital bombardment could cleanse what had been growing beneath our feet for decades. Ash began to fall. Grey flakes that drifted from the sky, or perhaps from the hive's upper levels, settling on surfaces like toxic snow, coating streets and buildings and the crowds that moved through them. It should have been ash from fires, from districts being burned in last desperate attempts at containment. But when I caught a flake on my palm and examined it closely, I saw that it was not ash. It was paper, burnt parchment, thousands upon thousands of documents being incinerated somewhere, their remains carried by unnatural wind to settle across the hive like evidence of systematic record destruction. They were burning the archives, destroying documentation, eliminating evidence of what had happened here, what had been allowed to fester, what authorities had known or should have known, or had deliberately ignored in favor of maintaining tithe quotas and production schedules. By the time the Inquisition finished its investigation, by the time the Exterminatus was complete, there would be nothing left to suggest who had been responsible, who had failed in their duties, who had permitted chaos corruption to take root, because acknowledging it would have required admitting to oversight failures that could not be admitted without consequences that were easier to avoid through willful blindness. The ash, the burnt documentation, tasted bitter on my tongue. Copper and burnt parchment, yes, but also something else. The taste of bureaucracy destroying itself, of an institution eating its own records to prevent accountability, of systems designed to maintain order choosing instead to eliminate evidence that order had failed. I walked through the evacuating crowds when I finally left the administrative complex, carrying my census slate despite knowing it was worthless, despite understanding that the populations I had documented no longer existed in any meaningful census-taking sense. They existed as bodies, yes, as biological entities still capable of movement and vocalization, but census data tracked citizens, tracked individuals with identities and functions and places within Imperial society. What moved through the streets now were refugees, were casualties in waiting, were numerical casualties that I would never get the opportunity to document, because documentation required surviving long enough to file reports, and survival had become increasingly unlikely with each passing hour. A child pressed a purity seal into my hand as I passed a small girl, perhaps 7 years standard, her face streaked with ash and tears, her eyes too old for her age because she had seen things that children should never witness. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "Please make it stop. You're Administratum, you have authority, make them stop it." I looked at the purity seal in my palm. Standard issue, the kind distributed by the ecclesiarchy in bulk, printed with prayers in High Gothic that few could read and fewer understood. "Blessed is the mind too small for doubt," it declared. "Blessed is the certainty that comes from faith. Blessed is the Emperor who protects his faithful servants." The Emperor protects. The lie we told ourselves, the lie that sustained Imperial civilization, the lie that was being revealed as lie by the death of our world. The Emperor protected nothing. The Emperor was distant beyond comprehension, enthroned on terror in a state that was neither life nor death, maintained by sacrifices of psychers whose souls were consumed to fuel the Astronomicon. The Emperor had never protected. The Emperor demanded sacrifice, demanded obedience, demanded that we die in service to an Imperium that measured our value only by our productivity and discarded us the moment that productivity failed to meet arbitrary standards. But I could not say this to the child, could not destroy what little faith she retained. So I pressed the purity seal back into her hand and told her to run, to find her family, to get as far from District 93 as she could manage before whatever had breached containment there spread further. She ran, disappeared into the crowd. I never learned whether she survived the next hour, much less the days that followed. Probably not. Probably she died with the rest of them, with all of us, reduced to ash and statistics in reports that would be classified beyond any clearance level, filed in archives that would be sealed for centuries, eventually forgotten as our world was forgotten, as the billions who died here were forgotten, as everything we had been and done and suffered was erased from history, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging that the Imperium had failed, and the Imperium could not fail, only its servants could fail, only we could be found deficient and purged, while the systems that had created the conditions for our failure remained unexamined and unchallenged. The wind grew stronger as night deepened. No longer just carrying screams and ash, but something else shapes at the edge of perception, movements in the darkness between functioning lumen strips, presences that were felt rather than seen, that registered as wrongness rather than as distinct entities. I saw civilians stop mid-flight, their expressions changing from fear to confusion to something worse, to the particular emptiness that comes when consciousness is evacuated, when a body continues to function but the mind that animated it has been displaced or consumed or transformed into something that no longer generates recognizably human thought patterns. They would stand there for moments, sometimes longer, bodies swaying slightly as if listening to sounds only they could hear. Then they would turn, would begin walking back toward the districts they had been fleeing from, their movements coordinated in ways that individual decision-making could not account for, as if they were being directed by shared impulse or external will, or something that existed in the space between conscious volition and autonomous response. Some tried to resist. I watched them fight against whatever compulsion had seized them, watched them struggle like drowning swimmers against currents too strong to overcome. Most failed. Most surrendered to the pull, their resistance lasting seconds or minutes before collapsing into compliance, before they joined the others walking toward the darkness, toward the districts where the screaming had stopped, not because the threat had passed, but because there was no one left to scream. But some succeeded in breaking free. They would stumble away, gasping, sometimes vomiting, their eyes wide with the particular terror of having felt something alien operating their bodies, having experienced the sensation of being passengers in their own flesh. They would run then, would flee with renewed desperation, and I would watch them disappear into the crowds and wonder if their escape was genuine or merely temporary, if whatever had touched them had truly released them, or was simply allowing them to run further before exerting its influence again. I should have run too, should have joined the evacuation, should have fled toward whatever illusory safety the crowds were seeking. But I did not, could not. Some combination of exhaustion and fatalism kept me standing there in the plaza outside the administrative complex, watching the hive die around me, documenting it mentally because my hands were too unsteady to operate the census slate anymore, because recording required precision I no longer possessed. A figure approached me through the ashfall, not walking with the purposeful direction of the evacuating crowds or the empty coordination of those under compulsion, but wandering, stumbling, as if navigation had become difficult. When they came close enough for me to see their face in the flickering lumen light, I recognized Vox operator Kelly, the woman I had pulled from her headset, who had survived but changed, who had been speaking in fragments ever since. "They're coming up," she said, her voice flat, emotionless, delivering information without affect or fear. "From below. They've been coming up for hours. Not through the main passages, those are sealed. Through the ventilation systems, through the water conduits, through spaces in the walls that shouldn't exist but do, gaps in reality that have been there all along, waiting. We built the hive around wounds we couldn't see. We've been living inside a structure that was already compromised, already bleeding into the warp, already claimed by things that exist outside the Emperor's light." "How do you know this?" I asked, though I already understood the answer, had understood it since the night she had heard the transmission that should have killed her. "Because they're still broadcasting," she said. "Because I can still hear them even without the Vox receivers. Because they showed me how to listen with parts of myself that I didn't know existed. And now I know. Now I understand. The Manufactorum complex wasn't built over a warp taint. It was built as a containment facility, a prison. And we've been the guards, except we never knew we were guards, never knew what we were guarding against, never understood that maintaining the tithes and the production quotas and the population levels was all part of keeping the prison sealed." She looked at me with eyes that reflected light in ways that human eyes should not, that showed colors I recognized from the permanent warp breach I had read about in prohibited texts, from conditions that should not exist on worlds that remained within real space. But the prison is opening now, has been opening slowly for decades, and we're not guards anymore, we're prisoners. We've always been prisoners. This whole world is the cell, and we've been locked inside it with what we thought we were keeping locked away. She walked past me, heading not toward evacuation routes, but toward the administrative complex's entrance, toward the archives where documentation molded and burnt ash continued to fall. I did not try to stop her, did not call after her. Just watched her disappear into the building where we had spent so much of our lives filing reports that no longer mattered, documenting populations that no longer existed, maintaining the fiction of order while chaos grew beneath our feet. The black wind blew stronger, the screaming had spread to new districts, and I stood in the falling ash, clutching my worthless census slate, and understood that the night was just beginning, that what was happening now was only the opening movement of our annihilation, that the true horror was still emerging from containment facilities that had never been adequate, that had only ever been temporary measures awaiting the moment when the Imperium would decide that containment was no longer cost-effective and elimination was preferable. The wind carried whispers now. Not words exactly, but sounds that suggested words, that implied meaning without fully forming it, that invited interpretation while remaining fundamentally incomprehensible. I did not listen, did not try to understand, because understanding was what had happened to Kelly, what had transformed the Vox operators, what was claiming anyone who opened themselves to perception of what existed in the spaces between human consciousness and the warp's influence. I turned away from the plaza, away from the administrative complex, and joined the crowds fleeing toward the illusory safety of the hive's outer districts, where perhaps we might have one more day, one more hour, one more moment of existence before the wind reached us, and the screaming began, and we joined the casualties that I would never document because I would be among them, because census takers do not survive the extinctions they record. The night of the black wind had only begun, and dawn would not come to end it. The priests came with the dawn that was not really dawn, leading processions through streets thick with ash, and the residue of horrors that had moved through during the night. I had not slept. Had spent the hours of darkness pressed against a hab-block wall in District 73, watching the evacuating crowds thin as the night progressed, as people were taken by exhaustion or despair, or things that emerged from alleys and ventilation grates to drag screaming victims into darkness. By the time grey light began filtering through the hive's atmospheric haze, artificial illumination from upper-level lumen strips rather than true sunlight, which had never reached this deep into the structure, I was one of perhaps 200 civilians still gathered in the plaza, all of us too terrified to move, too exhausted to flee further, waiting for whatever would come next with the resignation of those who have run out of options. The priests arrived in formation. Not the local clergy who had served our district's shrines and administered the daily prayers that punctuated work shifts, but senior ecclesiarchy officials in full ceremonial vestments, their robes heavy with purity seals and blessed chains, their faces hidden behind ornate masks that transformed them from individuals into living icons of imperial faith. They carried censers that billowed incense so thick it formed visible clouds, covering the other smells, the copper and burnt parchment, and underlying wrongness with perfumed smoke that was meant to sanctify but felt instead like concealment, like attempting to mask decay with fragrance rather than addressing the source. Behind the priests came the faithful. Thousands of them, emerging from side streets and residential blocks, flowing into the plaza in a ragged column that stretched back further than I could see. They were not evacuating, not fleeing. They were processing, walking with the purposeful direction of pilgrims approaching a holy site, their eyes fixed on the priests at the procession's head, their mouths moving in prayers that merged into a single continuous murmur that was part supplication and part desperation. Citizens of the Imperium, the lead priest intoned, his voice amplified by Vox equipment built into his mask, echoing across the plaza with mechanical certainty. The darkness gathers. The enemy seeks to claim what belongs to the God Emperor, but we are his servants, we are his faithful, and we shall not surrender to despair, we shall not flee from duty. We shall stand in this holy vigil and demonstrate our faith through defiance of heresy, through rejection of corruption, through absolute devotion to the Master of mankind, who protects those who serve him without question or doubt. The assembled civilians, evacuees and locals, and those who had nowhere else to go, responded with prayers that they had learned in childhood, that had been drilled into them through decades of mandatory devotions. The Emperor protects, the Emperor provides, the Emperor judges. In his light we are shielded, in his will we find purpose, in his mercy we are saved. But their voices carried no conviction. The words were rote, mechanical, prayers recited because recitation was familiar, and familiarity provided comfort, even when the comfort was illusory. I saw their faces as they prayed, saw the exhaustion, the terror, the fundamental knowledge that no amount of prayer would change what was coming, that the Emperor's protection was a promise that had never included worlds marked for Exterminatus, that faith was being demanded precisely because material salvation had become impossible. Children pressed purity seals onto cracked walls. I watched them work with the focused concentration of those given tasks to occupy their minds, to prevent them from contemplating circumstances that would shatter any remaining innocence. They moved along the plaza's perimeter, peeling backing from adhesive seals and pressing them onto ferrocrete that was already covered in layers of previous seals, creating overlapping patterns of prayer text and aquila symbols that transformed the walls into irregular shrines. Some of the seals were fresh, newly printed, their edges crisp and text legible. Others were ancient, yellowed with age, their prayers faded to illegibility, scavenged from abandoned shrines or family altars, brought as offerings to a desperate cause. An elderly woman knelt beside me, her joints cracking audibly as she lowered herself to the ash-covered ground. She held a rosary of human finger bones, actual bones, blessed by priests and strung on blessed wire, a relic that suggested either deep piety or access to black market ecclesiastical materials. She worked the bones through her fingers, muttering prayers in a dialect I did not recognize, possibly Old Gothic or some local variation that had evolved in isolated communities. "Will it help?" I asked, immediately regretting the question because it was cruel to challenge someone's faith when faith was all they had remaining. She looked at me with eyes that were roomy but not vacant, with an expression that suggested she had asked herself the same question and reached conclusions she was not willing to voice. "No," she said simply, "but doing nothing helps even less. Prayer gives us something to do while we wait. It reminds us we are human, that we were faithful servants, even if the faith was not returned. That we die as citizens of the Imperium rather than as animals fleeing predators." She returned to her devotions, and I understood that I had been answered with more honesty than I deserved, that she had articulated what many felt but could not speak, that prayer was performance rather than petition, ritual rather than communication, a way to maintain human identity in the face of dehumanizing horror. The procession continued throughout the morning hours. Priests led the faithful through predetermined routes, circuits that connected major shrines and holy sites, that traced patterns across the hive that were supposed to have sacred significance. The crowds grew larger as more joined from adjacent districts, as word spread that the ecclesiarchy was conducting vigils, that authorities were providing something that resembled leadership, even if that leadership consisted primarily of organized prayer and ceremonial displays. I followed the procession. Not from faith. My faith, if I had ever possessed any, had eroded through years of filing reports that documented suffering the Emperor never prevented, but because following provided direction, because the alternative was standing alone in an emptying plaza while darkness gathered, because being part of a crowd felt safer than isolation, even when safety was illusory, and the crowd itself was probably the most efficient gathering point for whatever would come next. The chanting grew louder as we walked, priests leading prayers that the crowd echoed with increasing fervor, with the desperation of those who knew these might be their final prayers, their last opportunity to demonstrate devotion before judgment arrived, not from the God Emperor, but from his servants, who had decided our world was beyond redemption. The liturgies were familiar standard imperial prayers recited at daily devotionals, at birth ceremonies and death rites, at the beginning and ending of shifts. But hearing them now, shouted by thousands of voices in near-perfect unison, amplified by voxcasters mounted on every corner, the familiar words took on new character. They became not prayers but defiance. Not requests for mercy but declarations that we had been faithful, that we had served as instructed, that if we were to die it was not because we had failed in our duty, but because the systems we served had failed us. Distant detonations punctuated the prayers. Not the deep thunder of orbital bombardment that would come later. I knew, when the Exterminatus proper began, but smaller explosions. Demolition charges, perhaps. Strategic destruction of infrastructure. The Imperium cleansing evidence before the final purge, eliminating facilities that might reveal what had been permitted to fester, what authorities had known or should have known, what compromises had been made in favor of maintaining tithe quotas and production schedules. Smoke rose from multiple districts, black columns that merged with the ashfall and the atmospheric haze to create a pall that reduced visibility to perhaps 50 meters. The procession moved through this artificial twilight, priests leading congregations that could not see their destination, that followed on faith, literal faith, the religious conviction that ecclesiastical authority knew where they were going and why, that this suffering had purpose beyond mere prologue to annihilation. We passed through District 48, where I had conducted census work only months ago, where I had documented families and recorded births and filed reports about population growth that had seemed like routine administrative data. The district was unrecognizable now. Buildings had collapsed, their structural integrity compromised by whatever had emerged from below or by demolition charges planted by authorities determined to contain spread. Bodies lay in streets, some covered with blankets or prayer sheets, others exposed because there were too many dead and too few living to provide even minimal dignity to corpses. The priests did not pause, did not conduct last rites for the dead, simply continued their procession, maintaining the fiction that forward movement had purpose, that destination existed and would provide something other than death postponed by hours rather than days. The congregation followed because stopping meant confronting what lay around them, meant acknowledging that prayer had not prevented these deaths and would not prevent their own. A child stumbled in front of me, a young boy, perhaps 10 years standard, his face grey with ash and exhaustion. I caught him before he fell, steadied him, felt how thin he was beneath his ragged clothing, how his body trembled with hunger or fear, or simply the accumulated stress of surviving conditions no child should experience. "Where are your parents?" I asked. He looked at me with eyes that were too old, that had seen too much. "Gone, taken during the night. Something came through our hab unit, made sounds that weren't sounds. Mother told me to hide, to cover my ears, to pray to the Emperor. I did. I prayed exactly like she taught me, but she screamed anyway. And Father, and my sister. I heard them screaming even through my hands over my ears. And when I came out, they were gone, not dead, gone. Like they had never existed except the blood was still there, on the walls, on the floor, proving they had been real. I had no response adequate to that testimony, no words that could provide comfort or explanation or hope. So I simply held his hand and continued walking with the procession, bringing him with me because abandoning him felt like additional cruelty in a situation already saturated with suffering. The priests led us to the Cathedral of the Emperor Ascendant, the hive's primary ecclesiastical structure, a building that rose 30 levels and could accommodate perhaps 50,000 worshippers in its main sanctuary. But 50,000 was insufficient for the crowds that had gathered, that continued to arrive from all districts, that filled the cathedral and spilled into the surrounding plazas, that covered every available space with humanity desperate for authority, for direction, for someone to tell them that their suffering had meaning beyond random catastrophe. The high priest emerged onto the cathedral's upper balcony, a figure made small by distance but magnified by vox amplification, his voice carrying across the assembled masses with the weight of absolute conviction. "Brothers and sisters in the Emperor's service," he began, and the crowd quieted immediately, thousands falling silent with the discipline of those trained to defer to ecclesiastical authority. "We face trial. We face judgment. Forces of darkness seek to claim this world, to corrupt it beyond redemption, to transform it into realm of heresy and damnation. But we are not defenseless. We possess faith. We possess devotion. We possess the absolute certainty that the God Emperor watches over those who serve him without question, without doubt, without the corruption of independent thought that invites damnation. The crowd murmured approval, desperate to believe, desperate to accept that their faith mattered, that their prayers were being heard and valued, even if not answered in the manner they desired. Some of you may wonder, the high priest continued, his tone shifting to address unspoken doubts, why the Emperor permits suffering, why the faithful are tested, why those who have served without failure must endure trial by darkness. This is the great mystery of faith, that suffering refines us, that trial proves our devotion, that only through absolute submission to the Emperor's will can we transcend our mortal limitations and achieve the salvation that awaits the truly faithful. It was theological justification for abandonment, philosophical framework that transformed institutional failure into divine plan, that recast our doom as spiritual trial, rather than acknowledging the material reality that our world had been compromised and the Imperium's only response was elimination. But the crowd accepted it because the alternative was accepting that their suffering was meaningless, that they would die not as martyrs proving faith but as casualties of bureaucratic failure, as populations written off because remediation was more expensive than extermination. We shall maintain vigil, the high priest declared. We shall pray without ceasing. We shall demonstrate our faith through absolute devotion, and in doing so, we shall prove ourselves worthy of the Emperor's mercy. Whether that mercy takes the form of deliverance or of peaceful death into his embrace, we accept his judgment without protest, without rebellion, without the corruption of will that separates humanity from heresy. More prayers followed, hours of them, the crowd remaining standing because kneeling would have required space that did not exist in the packed plaza, because exhaustion was collective and therefore less acute than it would have been individually, because the alternative to praying was confronting the futility of prayer, and confronting that futility would have shattered whatever fragile psychological structure was maintaining order. I prayed with them, moved my lips in approximation of devotional formulas, held the child's hand and felt him praying beside me with the fervor of those who still believed faith could matter. And I watched the priests on their balconies, watched their masked faces and elaborate vestments, and understood that they knew that deliverance was not coming, knew that these prayers were final prayers, knew that they were conducting mass funeral rites disguised as vigils, preparing their congregations for death while maintaining the fiction that hope remained. The detonations grew closer. The smoke grew thicker. The ash fall intensified until it covered the ground in grey drifts that resembled snow, if snow were toxic, and carried the residue of burnt documentation and possibly burnt flesh. And still the prayers continued. Still the faithful maintained their vigil. Still they believed, or pretended to believe, or simply performed belief, because performance was all that remained when substance had been stripped away by circumstances beyond any prayer's capacity to influence. The last procession had reached its destination. And that destination was not salvation, but merely a place to wait, together, for the annihilation that official theology could frame as mercy, but that would arrive as fire from orbit, as judgment delivered not by the God Emperor but by his mortal servants who had decided that billions of faithful prayers were worth less than the bureaucratic convenience of planetary elimination. We were the faithful. We were the doomed. And the distinction between those categories had collapsed into irrelevance. I was in the Vox archive when the final authorization came through. It was not intentional, my presence there. I had accompanied a priest who sought access to communication equipment, who believed he could reach the orbital fleet and plead for mercy on behalf of the millions gathered in prayer across the hive. The archive complex had been largely abandoned. Most Vox operators had either fled or been reassigned to military coordination channels, and the remaining staff were skeleton crews maintaining minimal functionality. Security had collapsed to the point where a census clerk and an ecclesiarchy official could simply walk into a facility that should have been restricted, could move through corridors lined with inactive Vox equipment without encountering anyone to challenge their presence. The priest, I never learned his name, had not thought to ask, was attempting to establish communication with the flagship in orbit when the transmission came through. Not on the channels he was accessing, but on a military frequency that his equipment was picking up as interference, as signal bleed that should have been encrypted beyond civilian capacity to decode. But whatever encryption had been applied was failing, or had been deliberately weakened, or perhaps the message was being broadcast on multiple channels simultaneously to ensure reception across all receiving stations in the fleet. The voice that emerged from the Vox speaker was flat, emotionless, purged of any tonal quality that might suggest the speaker was human rather than servitor or cogitator. But I recognized it as human, recognized the particular vocal pattern that came from augmetic vocal cords that had replaced organic tissue, from throats that had been rebuilt to eliminate the biological imperfections that introduced variation and emotion into speech. Authorization confirmed. Exterminatus protocol enabled. Target: designated world Epsilon Sanctorum 9. Threat assessment: level Omega. Warp contamination beyond remediation. Population compromised. Quarantine maintained. No evacuation authorized. Planetary sterilization to commence upon completion of evidence elimination protocols. Estimated timeline: 6 hours. All fleet assets to maintain orbital superiority. No surface contact permitted. This is final authorization. Emperor protects. Transmission ends. The words hung in the air like pronouncement of doom, which they were. Not metaphorically. Literally. 6 hours. We had 6 hours before the bombardment began, before lance strikes and cyclonic torpedoes would render the world's surface uninhabitable, before everything, the hive cities, the manufactorums, the billions of human beings who lived and worked and prayed, would be reduced to ash and slag and atmospheric contamination that would linger for centuries. The priest stood frozen at the Vox controls, his hands still on the transmission toggles, his body rigid with the paralysis that comes from hearing your death announced with bureaucratic efficiency. His mouth moved, trying to form words, trying to pray or protest or simply vocalize the horror of what we had just heard. But no sound emerged, just the working of his jaw, the silent shaping of syllables that his voice would not produce. I looked around the Vox archive, at the rows of equipment that hummed with power despite most being unmanned, at the data slates and parchment logs and all the documentation that recorded decades of communications. And I saw the clerks, the few remaining Vox operators who were supposed to be maintaining the facility, systematically destroying records. They worked with methodical efficiency, feeding parchment into incinerators, wiping data from cogitator cores, smashing recording crystals that contained voice logs of transmissions received and sent. One clerk had a flamer-prohibited equipment in an archive facility where fire represented catastrophic hazard and was systematically burning file cabinets, reducing decades of documentation to ash that was being vented through filtration systems overwhelmed by the volume of smoke being produced. "What are you doing?" I asked, though the answer was obvious, though I understood perfectly well what was happening but needed to hear it articulated, needed someone to confirm the terrible conclusion I had reached. The clerk with the flamer turned to look at me, his face illuminated by the weapon's pilot light, his expression empty of emotion, or perhaps so full of emotion that expression could no longer contain it. "Eliminating evidence," he said simply. "We've been ordered to destroy all records pertaining to the past 50 years of planetary administration, all communications logs, all incident reports, all documentation of what was found beneath the manufactorums and how long authorities knew about it and what decisions were made regarding containment versus elimination. Who ordered this? Does it matter?" He turned back to his work, applying fire to another cabinet that erupted into flames that roared up toward ceiling-mounted fire suppression systems that had either been disabled or were simply overwhelmed. Inquisition, probably, or Fleet Command, or the Administratum covering their complicity, someone with enough authority to order the destruction of evidence and enough power to ensure compliance. Someone who wants to ensure that when the Exterminatus is complete, when this world is a lifeless ball of scorched rock, there will be no records suggesting that it could have been prevented, that warnings were ignored, that production quotas were prioritized over containment protocols. I watched files burn, watched data slates being crushed under boots, watched crystals containing voice records, possibly including my own voice, from reports I had filed over decades of service being shattered into fragments too small to recover. And I understood that I was witnessing the final stage of our world's death, the administrative conclusion that preceded physical annihilation. We were not just being killed, we were being erased. Our existence was being rendered unprovable, our suffering unverifiable, our lives reduced to blank spaces in archive records that would never be filled, because the records themselves were being destroyed before the world that had generated them was sterilized from existence. My hands moved without conscious direction, reaching for the census slate I still carried, that I had maintained through everything, that contained decades of population data and documentation. I held it against my chest like a relic, like proof that mattered, like evidence that could somehow survive what was coming and testify to what had been permitted to occur here. But who would I testify to? Who would read my documentation? The slate contained local data, information that was meaningless without the context of the world that had generated it, and that world would cease to exist in 6 hours. My life's work, 23 years of meticulous census-taking, of recording births and deaths and migrations, of documenting populations with accuracy that had earned commendations from my superiors, would die with me, would be vaporized along with the billions whose existence I had spent my life documenting. The priest finally found his voice. "We have to tell them," he said, his tone urgent but hollow, as if he spoke from obligation rather than belief that communication would matter. "The congregations at the cathedral, the faithful gathered in prayer, they have a right to know. They deserve to understand that their prayers are not being heard, that no mercy is coming, that they have 6 hours to what? Prepare, accept, make peace with the end? They already know," I said quietly. "They've known since the warships arrived, since the audits began, since the purges started. They've been praying not because they believe deliverance is coming, but because prayer is what faithful citizens do while waiting to die. Because maintaining the rituals of belief is easier than acknowledging that belief has become irrelevant. Because acting as if the Emperor protects allows them to preserve identity as Imperial citizens, rather than acknowledging their casualties of Imperial judgment." The priest looked at me with an expression that suggested I had voiced heresy so profound he could not immediately formulate response, but he did not contradict me, did not offer theological correction or ecclesiastical censure, simply stared with eyes that showed he had reached the same conclusion but lacked the courage or honesty to articulate it. 6 hours, he whispered instead. "What do we do for 6 hours?" I had no answer, had no script for how to spend the final hours of existence. The Administratum had trained me for processing, for documentation, for maintaining records and filing reports. No one had provided instruction for how to face annihilation with dignity or grace, or anything resembling purpose. The Vox equipment crackled again. Not with new transmissions, but with death systems failing as power was redirected, as the archive complex's infrastructure began systematic shutdown, as resources were pulled toward whatever military operations were being conducted in preparation for the bombardment. The lumen strips flickered, creating stuttering illumination that transformed the archive into something nightmarish, into shadows and firelight, and the silhouettes of clerks destroying records with mechanical efficiency. I left, simply turned and walked out of the archive complex, leaving the priest standing at the Vox controls, leaving the clerks to their work of erasure, walking through corridors that were emptying as the few remaining personnel abandoned their posts because maintaining function for 6 more hours served no purpose, because the Imperium that had demanded their service for decades was about to eliminate the world that had housed that service. The streets outside were chaos. Not the organized chaos of evacuation or the disciplined chaos of military operations, but the fundamental chaos that emerges when order collapses completely, when authority ceases to function, when the systems that maintain civilization withdraw and leave only raw human behavior unconstrained by fear of consequence. Some had descended into violence. I saw mobs attacking those they blamed for the doom, saw lynch justice being administered to former administrators and Arbites, and anyone whose position had suggested authority that might have prevented what was coming. Saw bodies hanging from lumen posts, saw buildings burning not from bombardment or containment, but from simple rage, from the need to destroy something when the thing you wanted to destroy, the Imperium, the Inquisition, the systems that had condemned you, was beyond reach. Others had embraced hedonism. Entire blocks had transformed into impromptu celebrations, into orgies of consumption and indulgence, people drinking and coupling and fighting and celebrating because nothing mattered anymore, because consequences had become irrelevant when death was arriving in 6 hours regardless of behavior, because the prohibitions that had constrained them for lifetimes had lost all enforcement power. And some maintained their faith. I saw processions still moving through the streets, smaller now, reduced to hundreds rather than thousands, but still processing, still praying, still maintaining the rituals that defined them as faithful servants of the God Emperor, even as that Emperor's servants prepared to eliminate them from existence. I found myself walking toward the Census Bureau, toward the facility where I had spent most of my adult life, where my workstation still presumably existed, even if the work I had performed there no longer mattered. The building was burning, whether from violence or demolition or simply neglect of fire suppression systems, I could not determine. Flames rose from upper windows, and smoke poured from ventilation grates, and the heat was intense enough to keep me at distance, to prevent me from entering and retrieving anything I might have wanted to preserve. Not that preservation mattered, not when the world itself was being eliminated, not when my workstation and my files and my meticulous documentation would be vaporized along with everything else. In 6 hours minus, I checked the chronometer on my slate, minus 14 minutes that had passed since hearing the authorization, that had been consumed by walking and witnessing and trying to process the reality of imminent death. 5 hours and 46 minutes remaining. I sat on the steps of the burning Census Bureau, my back against stone that was growing warm from the fire within, and I opened my census slate. The screen illuminated, showing data I had recorded during my last shift before everything collapsed, population counts for districts that no longer existed, birth and death rates for people who were already dead or would be soon, projections for growth patterns that would never manifest because there would be no future to grow into. And I began to write. Not census data, not official documentation, but testimony. Personal record of what I had witnessed, what I had survived, what I understood about how we had arrived at this moment. I wrote because it was all I knew how to do, because documentation was my function, even when function had lost all purpose, because bearing witness felt important, even though I knew no one would ever read what I recorded. My hands shook as I wrote. From exhaustion, from fear, from the accumulated stress of watching my world die by degrees over days that felt like years. But I continued because stopping meant surrendering to the paralysis that had claimed the priest, to the empty horror of simply waiting for death without taking any action, however futile, to assert that my existence had mattered, that I had been something more than a number in someone else's records. The fire spread to adjacent buildings, the heat intensified. Ash fell thicker now, covering everything in grey that looked like snow if snow carried the residue of civilization being consumed by flames, both literal and metaphorical. And I wrote, documented, recorded, fulfilled my function as census clerk and witness until the very end, until fire or bombardment or simple exhaustion would force the stylus from my hand and silence the testimony I was recording for an audience that would never exist. 5 hours and 32 minutes remaining. The authorization had been given. The sentence was being carried out. And I sat in the ruins of my life's work, writing the final words that would die with me when judgment arrived from the sky. The Emperor protects, the faithful proclaimed. But I had heard the order. I knew the truth. The Emperor condemned. And his servants would execute that condemnation with the efficiency that marked all Imperial operations. We were the faithful. We were the doomed, and the difference had ceased to matter 6 hours ago when the final authorization was transmitted and our death became not possibility but certainty. The bombardment began with a sound like the sky tearing open. I heard it first, not saw it, because I was still sitting on the steps of the burning Census Bureau, my head bent over the slate where I had been recording testimony for hours that had compressed into single continuous experience. Time losing its usual structure when measured against imminent annihilation. But the sound cut through everything, through the roar of flames, through the chaos of the streets, through the prayers and screaming and desperate celebrations of those who had chosen various methods of facing the end. It was not the sound of individual weapons discharging, not the crack of last fire or the thunder of artillery. It was fundamental, primal, the sound of atmosphere being torn apart by energies that should not exist in real space, by weapons designed to crack continents and boil oceans. By the Imperium's most absolute expression of judgment, it resonated in my chest cavity, in my bones, in parts of my body that should not register sound but did, because this was not merely auditory phenomenon but physical assault on reality itself. I looked up. Through the smoke and ash and atmospheric haze, I saw the first lance strikes connecting with the hive's upper levels, beams of coherent energy that fell from orbit like pillars of light, except the light burned with intensity that made looking at it directly impossible, that seared after images into vision even through closed eyelids. Where the lances struck, matter simply ceased to exist. Not vaporized that would have left residue, would have created explosive force as materials transformed from solid to gas. This was erasure. Buildings that had stood for millennia were there one moment and gone the next, replaced by columns of superheated plasma that rose toward the sky like inverse lightning. The heat arrived seconds later. Not gradual warming but immediate overwhelming heat that transformed air into furnace wind, that made breathing an act of conscious effort because each inhalation felt like swallowing fire. The temperature climbed so rapidly that exposed skin began to redden, that moisture evaporated from eyes and mouth, that the ash covering everything began to smolder as if approaching its ignition point. I scrambled to my feet, the sensor slate clutched against my chest, and ran. Not toward any destination. There were no safe destinations, no shelters that could withstand what was falling from orbit, but away from the immediate heat, toward whatever illusion of survival instinct suggested might provide momentary refuge. Around me, others were doing the same, the streets filling with people who had been frozen by shock or indecision, but were now driven by the fundamental biological imperative to flee from immediate threat, even when flight was futile. Another lance strike. Closer this time. The building 3 blocks ahead simply disappeared, its entire structure converted to plasma and superheated gas that expanded outward in a shockwave that threw me to the ground with force that drove air from my lungs. I rolled, covering my head with my arms, feeling debris rain down, not recognizable fragments of architecture but powder, dust so fine it might have been sand, the reduced essence of ferrocrete and plasteel, and human bodies that had been pulverized by energies that broke molecular bonds. I crawled, could not stand, could not breathe deeply enough to support upright movement, crawled through ash that was now burning, that had reached temperature sufficient to ignite, creating ground-level fires that spread across surfaces that should not burn. My hands blistered where they contacted the heated ground. My lungs spasmed, trying to filter air that was more smoke than oxygen, that carried particles of superheated dust that seared throat and lungs with each desperate inhalation. The bombardment intensified. What had been individual lance strikes became sustained barrage, multiple beams falling simultaneously, creating overlapping columns of destruction that merged into walls of annihilating energy. I saw entire districts vanish in seconds. Saw architectural features I had used as landmarks for navigation during census work simply cease to exist. Saw the geography of the hive being rewritten as upper levels were systematically eliminated and their debris cascaded down onto lower levels in avalanches of pulverized stone and metal. I found shelter, if it could be called shelter, in a collapsed transit tunnel whose entrance had been blocked by fallen debris, but whose interior extended deep enough to provide momentary respite from the immediate heat. I crawled into darkness, into space barely large enough for my body, pulling myself along on elbows and knees because the tunnel was too low to permit any other form of movement. Behind me, the entrance glowed red with reflected light from fires and lance strikes, providing enough illumination to show that the tunnel extended perhaps 20 meters before ending in complete collapse. 20 meters of temporary safety, 20 meters between me and immediate death, 20 meters that would become tomb when the bombardment reached this depth, when the systematic destruction working its way down through the hive's levels finally arrived at the transit infrastructure and rendered it into the same superheated dust that was consuming everything above. I lay in the tunnel, gasping for air that was slightly cooler than the furnace heat outside, slightly less contaminated with particulates, and I listened to the world die. The sound was continuous now, no longer discrete impacts, but single, sustained roar, the audio signature of planetary surface being subjected to energies sufficient to sterilize it of all life, to reduce complex ecosystems to lifeless waste, to eliminate billions of years of geological development in hours of concentrated destruction. Through gaps in the debris blocking the tunnel entrance, I saw people running past, saw their silhouettes against the red-orange glow of the burning hive, saw them stumble and fall and rise and continue running, because stopping meant accepting death, and human biology fights acceptance, even when acceptance is rational. Some were on fire, their clothes ignited by radiant heat, their flesh burning as they ran. They did not stop to extinguish the flames, simply ran until they collapsed, until their bodies gave out, until death claimed them in whatever form, burning or asphyxiation, or simply the systemic failure that comes from sustained exposure to conditions human physiology was never designed to endure. A child appeared at the tunnel entrance, not the same child I had held hands with during the procession, but similar, young enough that survival should have been protected by adults, but old enough to understand that no protection was available. She looked into the tunnel, saw me lying there, and our eyes met for a moment that felt extended beyond its actual duration. She opened her mouth, possibly to ask for help, possibly to scream, possibly just to breathe, but no sound emerged. Just the opening of her mouth, the working of her jaw, the silent appeal that I could not answer because there was no help to provide, no salvation to offer, no action I could take that would make any difference to her outcome or my own. Then she was gone, pulled away or swept away, or simply choosing to continue running rather than crawling into this temporary shelter that would become permanent grave. I did not see which. Just the sudden absence where she had been, just the empty tunnel entrance glowing with red light and falling ash, and the particulate remains of everything that had been solid moments before. The Vox towers melted. I could hear them through the bombardment's roar, the distinctive sound of metal superstructure failing under heat, of communications infrastructure that had connected the hive's districts for centuries collapsing into slag. Their broadcasts ended mid-transmission, prayers and warnings and military coordination all cutting off simultaneously, as the equipment that had carried them was rendered into molten pools that spread across surfaces and cooled into irregular shapes that bore no resemblance to their original function. With the Vox towers went the last vestiges of coordination, of centralized communication, of any ability for populations to share information about where the bombardment was focused or where temporary refuge might exist. We were isolated now. Each survivor trapped in their own small space, their own temporary shelter, their own personal experience of annihilation, unable to communicate with anyone beyond immediate proximity, unable to know if anyone else still lived, or if they were the last consciousness remaining on a world being systematically sterilized. I pulled the census slate from where I had been clutching it against my chest and looked at the screen. It was cracked, damaged during the fall or the crawling, or simply from being gripped too tightly by hands that shook with exhaustion and fear. But it still functioned, still displayed the testimony I had been recording, still held the documentation I had compiled, because documentation was my function, even when function had ceased to serve any purpose. I tried to write more, tried to add to the record, to document what I was witnessing in this tunnel while the world ended above and around me. But my hands were too damaged, fingers burned and cut, and trembling too violently to operate the stylus with anything approaching the precision I had maintained for decades. The words appeared on screen as illegible scrawls, as marks that conveyed no meaning, as evidence that even my final function, the ability to record and document, was failing along with everything else. So I simply held the slate, pressed it against my chest where the heat of the burning world could not reach it immediately, where it might survive minutes longer than it would if left exposed, where its data might persist briefly beyond the moment when my body ceased to shield it. Pointless gesture, futile protection. The slate would die with me, would be vaporized or melted or buried under tons of collapsed infrastructure. No one would ever read what I had recorded. No one would ever know that Census Clerk Tertius 749 Hadrian had existed, had served faithfully, had documented his world's death with the same meticulous attention to detail he had applied to decades of population surveys. But holding the slate provided comfort in a situation where comfort had become the only remaining luxury, where physical survival beyond the next minute was too uncertain to plan for, and psychological survival required something to cling to, some object or purpose or identity marker that suggested the person holding it was still human, rather than merely biological matter awaiting processing into constituent elements. The heat intensified, grew from merely unbearable to actively lethal, to temperatures that began causing physical changes in my body that I could feel happening: skin cracking, blood vessels rupturing, proteins denaturing as cellular structure failed under thermal stress. My vision was failing, either from damage to my eyes or from simple exhaustion of the neural systems required to process visual information. The world reduced to shapes and colors without definition, to red-orange glow that might have been fires or might have been my own retinas burning out, to darkness at the edges that encroached steadily inward. I thought about my mother, about the woman who had called me Valis before the Schola Administratum claimed me and replaced my name with designation number. Wondered if she had known, when she released me to Imperial service at age 7, that she was surrendering me to system that would ultimately condemn me to death, not for individual failure but for institutional convenience. Wondered if she had believed the promises that faithful service would be rewarded, that loyal citizens would be protected, that the Emperor watched over those who served without question. Probably she had believed, had to believe, because the alternative was acknowledging that the Imperium's promises were lies, that protection was conditional on continued utility, that faith was demanded precisely because material security could not be guaranteed, because accepting those truths would have made continued existence unbearable, would have required raising a child in full awareness that his life would be consumed by service to systems that valued him only as resource to be exploited. She had done what parents did, had maintained the necessary fictions, had taught me prayers and devotions and proper respect for authority, had prepared me to function within the Imperium's vast machinery, had given me the tools to survive as long as survival was possible. And survival, I understood now in these final moments, had only ever been temporary, had only ever been conditional on circumstances I could not control and could barely perceive. My life had been measured from birth, 23 years of service before the world that had housed that service was eliminated because maintaining it had become inconvenient, because the cost of remediation exceeded the cost of replacement, because the Imperium's calculations had determined that billions of faithful lives were worth less than the resources required to save them. The tunnel was collapsing. I felt it rather than saw it, the pressure of debris settling, the sound of structural supports failing, the sensation of space contracting as tons of destroyed Hive City cascaded into the transit infrastructure. The 20 meters of temporary safety were being compressed, squeezed by the weight of everything above, transformed from refuge into tomb with the steady inevitability of geological processes accelerated to catastrophic speed. I could not breathe. The air was too hot, too contaminated, too thin. My lungs spasmed, trying to extract oxygen from atmosphere that no longer contained it in sufficient concentration, that had been transformed by heat and combustion into something that resembled air but lacked the components necessary to sustain life. My vision went dark. Not gradually, suddenly, completely, as if someone had extinguished the last light source. I did not know if my eyes had finally failed, or if the entrance glow had been blocked by collapse, or if I had simply lost consciousness, and what I experienced now was the final moments of neural activity before death completed its claim. I held the sensor slate, felt its weight, its familiar dimensions, its cracked screen against my palm. Documentation of a life spent documenting. Record of service faithfully performed. Testimony to a world that had died and a man who had died with it, both reduced to data that would survive perhaps seconds longer before being consumed by the same fires that consumed everything. No report, no ledger, no confession could matter anymore. But I had tried, had fulfilled my function until function itself became impossible, had maintained my identity as documenter and recorder even when recording had lost all purpose. That would have to be enough. The heat peaked, the pain peaked, the darkness completed its encroachment. And in that final moment, before consciousness dissolved completely, I understood that no one would read this testimony, that my death would go unrecorded except as statistical estimate in inquisitorial reports, that I would vanish from existence as thoroughly as the world that had birthed me. The Emperor protects, they had promised, but the Emperor's protection had arrived as fire from orbit, as judgment without mercy, as annihilation delivered with bureaucratic efficiency. And I, who had served faithfully, died anyway. Now I sit beneath the ruins, the data slate still in my lap, its glow flickering like a dying votive candle. I do not know how I survived the initial bombardment. Do not remember the transition from the collapsing transit tunnel to this space, a small cavity formed by chance arrangement of debris, by structural elements that fell in patterns that created void rather than filling it, by accident or providence, or simply the mathematics of destruction that occasionally produces pockets of survival amid comprehensive annihilation. I woke here, if waking is the correct term for regaining consciousness in circumstances that suggest consciousness itself is questionable. That might be hallucination or dying dream, or the last neurological firings of a brain deprived of oxygen. But the slate is here. Still functional, though its screen is more cracks than intact surface, though its power indicator shows depletion that suggests I have perhaps minutes remaining before it dies. And my hands, though burned and damaged, can still operate the stylus with enough precision to record these final words. Not for rescue. There will be none. I understand that with the clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose, from having surrendered all hope and discovering that surrender brings its own form of peace, the terrible tranquility of accepting that death is not approaching but has already arrived, and what remains is merely documentation of its process. The bombardment has not stopped. I feel it through the debris that surrounds me, through the ground itself, through vibrations that travel through stone and metal, and presumably through my body, though I can no longer distinguish between physical sensation and phantom perception. The systematic destruction continues above me, or perhaps around me, or perhaps I am already deeper than I realize, already buried so thoroughly that above and around have lost distinction, that directional references have become meaningless when you exist in cavity whose dimensions you cannot determine and whose location within the larger structure of the dying hive you cannot ascertain. The air grows hotter by the minute. Not the immediate overwhelming heat of the initial strikes, but slower, more insidious warming, the kind that comes from being inside something that is heating from outside, that is being cooked like meat in an oven, except the oven is planetary scale and the meat is everything that once lived here. I can feel the temperature increasing in increments, each breath slightly more painful than the last, each moment bringing me closer to the point where the heat will exceed my body's capacity to dissipate it, where thermal regulation will fail, and I will simply cook from inside, my proteins denaturing, my cells rupturing, my flesh transforming from living tissue to something that resembles it but lacks the organization necessary for continued function. The planet's crust is fracturing. I feel that too deep grinding sounds that travel through solid matter, that suggest geological processes that should take millennia being compressed into hours, that indicate the bombardment is not merely sterilizing the surface, but cracking the underlying structure, breaking the world itself, rendering it into fragments that will eventually cool into asteroid belt, or perhaps coalesce into something new after millions of years of gravitational sorting. But those are processes beyond human timescale, beyond any relevance to my immediate situation, beyond anything except abstract intellectual recognition that the destruction is comprehensive, that nothing will remain to suggest this world existed or housed billions of lives that served the Imperium faithfully before being eliminated for failing to serve perfectly. I have been writing for I do not know how long. Time has become unreliable, moments stretching or compressing without pattern, chronometers meaningless when you exist in darkness beneath ruins while the world dies around you. But I have filled the slate's remaining memory with testimony, with documentation of everything I witnessed from the day the sky went dead until this moment, when I sit in a tomb of my civilization's remains and record words that will die with me. Writing is all I have left of who I was, the only function I can still perform. The last vestige of identity that distinguishes me from the corpses that surely surround me, that fill this cavity and the rubble beyond, that number in the billions across the planet's surface, that represent the final harvest of a world whose crime was hosting corruption that authorities had permitted to grow, because acknowledging it would have required admitting oversight failure. I wonder if the Inquisitor who authorized this destruction will sleep well. If they will file their report, world-designated Epsilon Sanctorum 9 successfully purged of chaos contamination and move to the next assignment without dwelling on the billions eliminated, the faithful who died praying, the children who perished without understanding why their prayers went unanswered. Probably they will. Must, perhaps, because functioning as Inquisitor requires the capacity to order genocide without being paralyzed by moral consideration, requires accepting that individual lives matter less than systemic integrity, requires viewing populations as numbers to be adjusted when those numbers represent threat to larger structures. I do not hate them. The Inquisitor. The fleet command that executed the order. The authorities who permitted contamination to grow until elimination became necessary. I am too exhausted for hate, too close to death to maintain the emotional intensity that hate requires. I understand them, even. Understand the logic that values the Imperium's survival over any individual world's preservation, that accepts calculated losses in service of preventing greater catastrophe, that requires someone to make terrible decisions so that billions of others can continue existing without being burdened by knowledge of what was sacrificed for their safety. But understanding is not forgiveness, is not acceptance, is simply recognition that the systems that killed me were not malicious but mechanical, not cruel but efficient, not evil but merely vast beyond any capacity for individual consideration. I was crushed by machinery too large to notice me, eliminated by processes that operated at scales where my existence registered only as statistical artifact, condemned by judgments that never considered me as person, but only as component of compromised population. The slate is failing. Its glow dimming, its response to the stylus becoming sluggish, its power cell depleting toward the final shutdown that will silence this testimony permanently. I type faster, trying to outpace the failure, trying to complete this record before the capacity to record ends. I want these words to matter. Want to believe that somehow they will survive, will be discovered by some future expedition, will be read by someone who will understand what happened here and perhaps, question whether it was necessary, whether billions of faithful deaths could have been prevented, whether the Imperium's judgment was proportional to offense or simply convenient to administrative requirements. But I know they will not survive. Know that this cavity will collapse completely or be filled with molten stone or simply be compressed under pressures that will reduce everything to its constituent atoms. Know that the slate will die, and I will die, and these words will vanish as thoroughly as the civilization that produced them. Still I write, because writing is what I am, what I have always been. Census Clerk Tertius 749 Hadrian, documenter of populations, recorder of births and deaths, and all the small details that transform individuals into statistics that administrators can process. I write because even though the writing serves no purpose, even though no one will ever read what I record, the act of writing maintains my identity in these final moments, prevents me from dissolving into the same meaningless biological matter that surrounds me. I write because I refuse to die silent, refuse to be eliminated without leaving some mark, however temporary, however futile. Refuse to accept that my existence was so inconsequential that it can be erased without testimony, without witness, without someone recording that I was here, that I saw what happened, that I understood the mechanisms of my own destruction, even if understanding could not prevent it. The air tastes like ash now, like burnt parchment and copper, and all the familiar smells that have defined these final days, concentrated and intensified until they are no longer smells but physical presence in mouth and throat and lungs. Each breath deposits more particulate, more of the reduced essence of my civilization coating the tissue that is trying to extract oxygen from atmosphere that contains less with each passing moment. I am dying. Have been dying since the bombardment began, but the process is accelerating now, approaching completion, reaching the point where biological systems can no longer maintain the fiction of function. My vision is almost completely gone. I see only the slate's glow, diffuse and indistinct, no longer capable of resolving into the text I am presumably still producing, though I can no longer verify that my stylus movements are generating coherent words rather than random marks. My hands are failing. The burns and trauma and simple exhaustion combining to produce tremors that make precision impossible, that transform writing into approximation, into gestures that hope to convey meaning, even when mechanical execution has degraded beyond reliability. But I continue, because stopping means surrendering the last function, abandoning the final purpose, accepting that I am already dead, and what remains is merely biological processes running down toward their inevitable conclusion. I want to be angry, want to feel rage at the injustice of dying for crimes I did not commit, for contamination I did not cause, for failures that were institutional rather than individual. Want to die defiant, cursing the Imperium that demanded my service and then eliminated me when that service occurred in contexts that proved inconvenient. But I am too tired for anger, too damaged for defiance, too close to the end to maintain emotional intensity beyond the simple, desperate need to finish this testimony, to complete this final documentation, to fulfill my function until the very last moment when stylus falls from hands that can no longer grip it and consciousness fades into the darkness that has been encroaching since the bombardment began. I was faithful. That is what I want recorded, what I need someone to know, even though no one will ever read this. I was faithful. I served as instructed. I filed my reports and maintained my records and performed my duties with the diligence that the Administratum demanded. I was not corrupt, not heretical, not compromised by the chaos contamination that grew beneath the manufactorums. I was simply here, living in a world that had been marked for elimination before I was born, serving systems that had already determined my life was forfeit before I filed my first census report. I did not deserve this. None of us deserved this. We were faithful servants who died because faith was insufficient, because service was not enough, because the Imperium that demanded our devotion repaid that devotion with annihilation when our continued existence became inconvenient to administrative requirements. The Emperor protects, they told us. But the Emperor's protection was selective, conditional, withdrawn when populations ceased to serve their function or when maintaining them required resources better deployed elsewhere. The Emperor protects those who are useful, the rest die. We died. I die now. The slate is going dark, its screen flickering, showing fragmentary images of the text I have been producing, displaying words that might be this testimony or might be corruption as its systems fail, as power depletion combines with thermal damage to produce errors that cascade toward complete shutdown. My last words then, my final documentation, my testimony as census clerk and witness and faithful servant who served until service became impossible. We were not heretics, we were not corrupt, we were simply inconvenient. And the Imperium eliminates inconvenience with the same efficiency it applies to all administrative functions. We existed, we served, we died faithful. Let this be our memorial, even if no one ever reads it. Let this be proof that we were human, that we suffered, that we deserve to be remembered, even if memory dies with us. I am Census Clerk Tertius, 749 Hadrian. I was called Valis before they gave me a number. I lived 23 years. I die now, beneath the ruins of my world, holding documentation that will die with me. The Emperor protects. But not us. Never us. The slate dies, screen going dark, power cell depleted, final words lost to